Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this training on the State Fiscal Year 23 Subrecipient Monitoring. My name is Jean Booth. I'm with the Victim Services Grants Management Unit. We have a lot to go over today. Your time is important to us, just as important that we offer instruction and communication between our agency and yours. Today, we're going to go over the monitoring documents and monitoring process in detail. We're going to ask some questions regarding your agency. Please locate the chat box to answer. What do you think of when you hear the word monitoring? There are no wrong answers. Just whatever you hear or think of when you hear the word monitoring, you place that in the chat box. Overseeing. Check on the program and finances to make sure we're in compliance. Reviewing. Check up of grant compliance and goals of agency. Clients check. Awesome. Thank you guys for taking the time to answer that. Has your agency ever had subrecipient monitoring? A for yes, B for no, or C, I don't know. Awesome. It looks like most of you have had monitoring, or at least know that you had a monitoring. I'm pretty sure all of you have had a monitoring at some point from our agency, but it is always good to kind of attend these trainings to figure out like what our expectations are for monitoring. So let's take a minute to talk about the purpose of monitoring. This definition on the slide is how the Office of Victims of Crime, or OVC, defines monitoring. Since the OVC administers our VOCA funding, and VOCA funding is the largest funding source that we oversee, it's important for us to make sure we're meeting all the federal requirements for monitoring our agencies. OVC's monitoring definition is that the overall purpose of monitoring is to ensure the provision of effective victim assistance services through successful subrecipient performance. Monitoring provides reasonable assurance that the subrecipient has administered the funding in compliance with laws, regulations, and provisions of the award, and that the required performance goals are being achieved. A key thing that we want to highlight in this definition is the word successful. Our goal at DCIS is to help make sure that your agency is as successful as possible at providing the grant-funded services. The goal of monitoring is to provide feedback to subrecipients prior to any item becoming a huge issue. Monitoring are completed every 2 years on all funded agencies. We monitor to observe and check the progress, quality, and integrity of the grants that we fund. Open communication, training, technical assistance, coaching, and monitoring are offered and performed by our subrecipients as a way to ensure that we know what's going on with your programs and that we're able to provide guidance, direction, and feedback before a minor issue becomes a big problem. It is important to understand that a monitoring is not an audit. We are not auditors. It is a federal requirement that we understand what is going on in your agency, specifically the programs that we fund. We are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the funding is being spent in a way that follows federal rules and guidance. In order to do that, we monitor the programmatic and fiscal portions of every agency that we fund. While it may seem similar to an audit, it is very important to understand that this is not an audit. An audit is a formal, systematic, and disciplined approach designed to evaluate and improve effectiveness of processes and related controls. Auditing is governed by professional standards completed by individuals independent of the process being audited and normally performed by individuals with one of several acknowledged certifications. Objectivity in governance reporting is the benefit of independence. Monitoring is an ongoing process, usually directed by management, in this case, your state administering office or us, to ensure processes are working as intended. Monitoring is an effective device control within a process. Federal monitoring requirements. You've completed the self-assessment during the application process, so step 1 is done. The risk assessments were completed and levels were given to each subrecipient at the time of your executed notice was issued. So step 2 is done. If your agency is due to receive an on-site review, you've already received this email. Due to COVID, some of our monitorings may be virtual. It is required of us to maintain the documentation requested for your monitoring and follow up with any deficiencies and findings to better help your agency improve documentation and services that are required from the federal level. If your agency is scheduled to have a monitoring this fiscal year, you have already received a calendar invite with this email. The calendar invite specifies the date and time of the monitoring. If virtual, a meeting link and attachment will be added to the calendar invite at a later date. If in person, the attachments will be added to the invite at a later date. The attachments are also in the documents included with meeting invite. The list of grants we will be reviewing and the information on when the documents are due to us are already included in that invite. All monitoring documents should be emailed to our staff by Friday, September 30th, 2022. Every agency received a 7-page federal civil rights compliance checklist. This is a required form that must be completed by every agency yearly. This form must be completed and returned to our agency along with attending a mandatory civil rights training that will be scheduled at a later date. Your agency will have already received the document request checklist if you're doing a monitoring this fiscal year. This will have 2 sections that we will go over in detail, programmatic and fiscal. On the top of this form, you will see your agency's name, address, the period we are reviewing, your assigned analysts, and the awards that we are reviewing. The review period and awards are helpful for the requested information in the performance and fiscal documentation. You can see that in our example, Crystal Lake will be monitored from July to August of 2022, and we will be reviewing their VOCA and marriage license awards. Talking about the information that we've just discussed, let's ask a few questions. Please locate your chat box to answer. The period of performance on my checklist is July 1st, 2022 to August 30th, 2022. I return documentation for the following time period: September and October 2022, B, June and July 2022, C, sometime within 2022, D, July and August 2022, or E, none of the above. Fantastic, that is correct. We're going to supply documentation for D, July and August 2022. True or false, and you can answer T or F in the chat. All monitoring documentation should be sent to DCFS the day the monitoring is scheduled. You guys are on it. False. The email regarding your monitoring will have a date that you need to submit your documentation by. This date for this fiscal year is September 30th, 2022. This gives DCFS staff time to review the documentation prior to the monitoring meeting and reduce the need for multiple meetings. This is the list of programmatic information we need to review. You are allowed to write on the checklist and send it back with your notes. For example, if you do not have licensed staff, you can write not applicable or NA on the item so we know that you didn't forget to send it, it just doesn't apply to you. It is extremely helpful to our staff if your agency can send each of these documents in a separate file labeled 1, 2, 3, etc. If that means that multiple emails are necessary, that's fine. An example of multiple emails is on the screen. What's most important to us is that all the information is provided in a manner that is easily navigable. All documentation provided should be within the performance period stated on top of the checklist for the grants requested that are listed on the checklist. It is extremely helpful for us if you can separate the files that they are listed on the checklist. An example of what this looks like is on your screen. You can see that this agency listed all their documents in the order it is on the checklist, which helps speed up the process of the review. Looks like we have a question in the chat box. Are you able to receive documents via Google Drive link? Sometimes. We have IT safeguards that don't always allow us to open the Google Drive links, so we can attempt to receive documents that way, and if for whatever reason it's not working on our end, we'll have to have you send them via email. But thank you, that's a good question. Okay, so number 1, your organization chart. This is an example of what an org chart looks like. It's our department's current org chart. When we review this, we're looking to see if the individuals reimbursed in the award are listed. We also look at it when you're reviewing your fiscal and internal control policies. Program staff and job titles. Your program staff and job title list will obviously look a little different than this, as this is our program staff and job title list. You will list all staff associated with each funding source that we're reviewing. You must provide copies of all licensed employees that fall under the grants listed on your checklist. These licenses must be current and fall under the review period. The easiest way to do this is go onto the board where the employee is licensed through and search their names. Therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers are some examples of licensed staff. You can provide a screenshot of a current license from the state board they're licensed through. All licensed staff working with victims must have a current active license, and this must be verified by your agency yearly. Contracts. If you have any contracts in the contract section of your budget for any awards that we're monitoring, we will need copies of those contracts. If you don't have any contracts on your awards, this will not apply to your agency. If you do have contracts, copies of all contracts must be provided prior to the initial reimbursement of the contractor. They must be for the grant period and have specific details regarding expectations, pay, contract start, and end dates. Contracts need to be reviewed at your agency level at least once every 3 years. They should also have some language about confidentiality. Speaking of confidentiality policies must be provided for all clients, staff, and volunteers that work with our grants. They must be informed, time-limited, and signed. Policies and procedures. Please send us the program policies and procedures that are funded under the grants we are reviewing. Policies, procedures, and employee handbooks should be reviewed and updated at least every 2 years. Please share separately your drug-free workplace policy. This might be already included in number 6, policy and procedures, but please make sure to send it as a separate file. While we do not need copies of drug tests, we just need a copy of your policy. Travel policy and procedures need to include grant-specific regulations for travel found in GERS 2317 and in the RFR training provided earlier this year. While the actual travel policies will be unique to each agency on how this process works, you do need to follow our travel regulations stated in GERS as well. If none of your awards have travel or training in their budget, you can skip this item as not applicable. Please submit a list of your current board members. Contact information is not necessary, but a list of members, including active, inactive, and vacant, does need to be provided. If you're a government agency, you can skip this as not applicable. Please include the board minutes from the review period listed on your checklist. If you do not have board meeting minutes during the dates on the checklist, then provide the most recent board meeting minutes. Again, this will not be applicable to governmental agencies. Grievance policies procedures. A copy of client, staff, and volunteer grievance policies needs to be included. These may look a little differently for each role, but should generally follow the same procedure. As we go through these, remember that we have provided some sample policies and procedures with this training to help you if you need to develop any of these, and we are available to provide technical assistance if you need to develop some of the items that are required. If you're a member of the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, they can also assist you with policies and procedures. Some or all of these might be part of number 6 policies and procedures that you're submitting to us, but we do request that you send the necessary documents to assist us during the review. A copy of your agency's non-discrimination statement and policy must be provided. Disaster response plans should cover things that are unexpected events such as fire drills, terror attacks, blackouts, flooding, pandemics, active shooter, etc. Every staff member and volunteer should be aware of the disaster response plans and should have documented reminders in their files at least yearly. Your limited English proficiency policy should include persons who do not speak English and persons who have difficulty hearing. This policy should not be exclusive of English and Spanish populations. Whistleblower policies and procedures need to be included. We've already talked about this form, but please remember the Civil Rights Compliance Checklist is required to submit yearly. We will send this checklist out to your agency in the next couple of weeks. Please provide a copy of a blank client file. Everything that is given or done with the client should be provided to us. This includes, but is not limited to, intake forms, confidentiality forms, non-discrimination assessments, safety plan, progress notes, demographic information, or any other documentation that you give to your clients. If all your files are electronic, we ask that you do screenshots of those files, blank client files. If you cannot provide those, please reach out to our office and we'll observe the blank client file either in person or virtually. Thank you. Any printed materials paid for by grant funding need to be included. These must include the statement found in Section C on your NOTA. On the screen, you'll see an example of the Section C statement. Please include any applicable MOUs or memorandum of understandings with your documents. Please remember that these must be current and within the review period. Breach of PII. What is your agency policy or response to an actual or imminent breach of personally identifiable information or PII? We do need this information and this policy. Background checks for staff and volunteers designated to grants need to be provided with PII or personally identifiable information redacted. For GER 2322, your equipment and inventory log needs to be provided and updated yearly with the use and condition of the equipment paid with grant funds. If you do not have the equipment budget on any of your reports, this will not be applicable to you. The inventory log should have a list of what is provided on your screen. It's also in your GERS. All right, now we're going to take a few minutes and test your knowledge from the information received today. Take a second to look at the chat box and we'll begin our questions. How often is it recommended that policies and procedures be reviewed and updated by your agency? A, once per year, B, every 2 years, C, every 5 years, D, as needed, or E, policies don't need to be updated. You guys are just going through these questions. You're correct. It's B, every 2 years, policies should be reviewed, updated, and documented. While agencies should update them as needed, a full review should be completed at least every 2 years. Current proof licenses should be submitted for A, all mental health providers, B, all licensed legal staff, C, all licensed staff working on grant awards, D, therapists only, or E, licenses don't need to be current. Yeah, that's correct. All licensed staff working on a grant fund award must be current on their licensure. Confidentiality policies and verification need to be for executive staff only, all staff, volunteers, and clients. Confidentiality is assumed, or indeed none of the above. That's correct. All staff, volunteers, and clients must be notified and have documentation in their files of confidentiality policies. The agent's grievance policy should cover staff, volunteers, contractors, clients, all of the above, or none of the above. What do you guys go today? That's correct. All of the above. Staff, volunteers, contractors, and clients need to be notified of the grievance policies. You can answer T or F. Agencies using electronic files do not need to send a copy of a blank client file. That's correct. The answer is false. You will still need to send a copy of a blank client file using screenshots. Reach out to us if you have questions or need assistance. Are there any questions over anything we've gone over today so far? I know it's a lot of information kind of spewed at once. Please feel free to reach out in the chat box if you have questions. If you're uncomfortable placing questions for everyone to read, at the bottom of the little chat thing, there's a drop-down icon. You can always ask your questions either to myself, Christine, or the organizer, and that'll hide it from everyone else. Question is for inventory. If it wasn't funded by a grant, do we need to send it in? No, if it's not grant funded or even partially grant funded, then no, we don't need to have the documentation of your inventory. It is a practice for your agency to keep inventory of all items, but we just want the inventory of the item that we're paid for by the grant listed on your award. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to the fiscal documentation. If you guys have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box and we will answer the questions. The same process should be done with your fiscal document. Separate files listed numerically, following the review period listed and the grants being reviewed. Number 23, 24, 25, etc. If that means that multiple emails are necessary, that's totally fine. What's most important to us is that all the information is provided in a manner that is easily navigable. All documentation should be within the performance periods stated on the top of the checklist for the grant requested that are listed on the checklist. We'll go into detail on all the documentation in just a moment. For your insurance certificate, please remember that we only need the insurance accord, not your entire policy. The accord or certification is the one-page document that will have a summary of the information we need to see, and at the bottom will have us listed as certificate holders. We don't want to be policy holders, but we must be a certificate holder on your insurance accord. You can see a copy of an accord with sensitive information removed on the slide. Financial policies and procedures. Please provide a copy of your agency's fiscal policies and procedures, including a separation of duties, internal controls, and your procurement policy. Again, we will have samples of these for you if you need help getting them in place. It's also important that your staff know policies and procedures and are following them. Internal controls. Provide your internal control policies. Internal controls are the mechanisms, rules, and procedures implemented by your agency to ensure the integrity of financial and accounting information, promoting accountability and preventing fraud. An example of one of the things that should be included in this policy is the separation of duties. Work duties that are divided among different people to reduce the risk of error or inappropriate action. Sometimes the internal controls are part of the agency's fiscal policies and procedures. You need to check to make sure they are either addressed in fiscal PMPs or separately. Please provide a copy of your general ledger. Yes, we will need the full agency and a separate ledger for the grants that we fund. On this slide, you'll see an example of a rejected chart of accounts and an example of what should be included on a chart of accounts. I know the redacted one is a little difficult to follow because so much of it was redacted. We just wanted to ensure that all the BII was hidden. But this is what your chart of accounts should look like when you submit it to us. Obviously not redacted. A cost allocation plan identifies activities and activity pools, directly traces or estimates costs to activities and cost objects, assign costs to activity cost pools, calculate activity cost drivers rates, assign costs to cost objects, and prepare reports. Here you can see the first page of a redacted cost allocation plan. Cost allocation plans should both be a narrative and a table. The table will show the breakdown of costs allocated by the funding sources. An example of this is on the next slide. This is an extremely simplified cost allocation table. Yours will have more detail allocated to your expenses and your funding sources depending on the rules or allocabilities of your various funding streams. This is just a simplified example of what a cost allocation table would look like. Accounts payable. Here's an example of a redacted account payable. A matching allocation table should be a quick snapshot of all your match sources allocated to each funding source that requires match by month. This shows us that your match is documented, tracked, and unduplicated. Here's an example of an organization budget. The one you submit to us will most likely look a little different, but this is an example if you're unsure what this should look like. This is an example of what your indirect cost pool should look like. You can see how it is allocated to the funding source and allocated as an indirect expense. While you do not need to show us the invoices and payments for indirect costs, they do need to be allocated in your accounting system. And just so that you're aware, the reason this isn't redacted is that this is a completely fictitious indirect cost pool. All the names and payments and everything on here is fictitious, so we're not overstepping on anybody's PII. This is an example of a redacted negotiated indirect cost agreement. If your agency has one of these, it does need to be shared with us. If your agency does not have one, just let us know that you don't. You are not required to have a federally negotiated indirect cost agreement, nor are you required to utilize indirect in your budget. However, if you do, you are responsible for documenting it. All agencies are required to have yearly federal sync audit if they receive over $750,000 in federal funding total, not just on one federal grant. So, if your agency receives $500,000 in VOC funding and $300,000 in FIPS funding, you will receive over $750,000 in federal funding and need to have a single audit performed. If your agency receives less than $750,000 in federal funding, you do not need to have an audit. This is a redacted example of the employer quarterly contribution report. We will also accept the accounting weight report if you have it available. Number 36 are bank statements. Those are pretty self-explanatory. All right, we're going to test your knowledge from the information provided today. Take another second to locate the chat box and we'll begin our questions. Which of these is an example of an internal control policy? A, grievance policy, B, confidentiality, C, travel, D, separation of duties, or E, none of these are internal controls. That's correct. D, separation of duties policy is an internal control. True or false? If VOCA is your largest funder, you should allocate 100% of all expenses to Vocate until the funding runs out, and then bill other funding sources. I'm so super glad you guys all said that was false. False. You should have a cost allocation plan that details how expenses will be separated out and divided across funding sources. True or false? Agencies using 10% de minimis rate do not need to document what the indirect funds were used for. That is correct. False. Indirect costs need to be separated out in your accounting system and tracked by funding sources. Even if you're using the federal de minimis 10% rate, you do need to separate those out in your accounting system and track them by their funding sources. Are there any questions on the fiscal documentation? Or on anything else that we've gone over today? Okay, let's go on and talk about our monitoring form. This is a copy of the first page of our monitoring form. A copy of the entire form will be sent to each subrecipient that we are doing virtual or on-site review with prior to our visit. A monitoring form example was sent also on the supporting documents for this training. What to expect with your monitoring? While 3 hours are reserved for your monitoring, we do not anticipate them lasting that long. A lot of the time is dependent upon if all documentation was sent on time from your agency, if the appropriate staff is available, and how many questions or follow-up is necessary. We tend to reserve extra time to provide technical assistance or answer any questions you may have. We expect that all of your documents are sent to us by the deadline provided in your monitoring email, which was September 30th, 2022, so that we can review them prior to our visit. During the visit, at least one programmatic and one physical person should be available from your agency to answer questions. We will talk about what was sent, ask about any missing documents, briefly discuss your scope of work, and then we'll ask a handful of questions that are listed on the monitoring form. Once we're done with our questions, we will have an exit discussion where we'll go over any recommendations or findings that were discovered during the monitoring. Following the exit discussion, we'll assist with any technical assistance or questions you may have that you would like answered. Within 30 days of the monitoring, you will receive an email from our staff with their monitoring closure or finding letter. From that point, you will have 30 days to rectify the findings. And this is kind of why people assume that monitoring are like audits, because we use similar language to what's in an audit. Unfortunately, we're unable to change the language because we are required to have certain language from the feds. And when we're talking about recommendations or findings, we're talking about is as a recommendation, it's something that should be looked at eventually with your agency because it has the potential to become an issue. Where the finding is something that needs to be rectified immediately because it already is an issue. There was a question on the chat that says, will monitoring most likely be virtual or in person? If you've received a monitoring email, it will say in the email whether or not it is virtual or in person. It's about a 50-50 split this time. This list of challenges is taken directly from the OVC website or Office of Victims of Crime as concerns that they have that impact our subrecipients directly. Those of you who have been funded by our agency for a few years will recognize a few of these bullet points, as these are things that we've been actively working on to improve with everyone that we fund. So for some of you, the goals and objectives are not measurable on your scope of work. You know that we've been working quite a few years at trying to make scope of work objective and measurable to help rectify this challenge. We had another question pop in on the chat box. When monitoring takes place, does the entire staff need to be present or can they not be present? So your entire staff does not need to be present. We just need at least one person from fiscal and one person from your programmatic. If you take a look at the monitoring document sample that was sent on the meeting calendar invite, you'll see the various questions that will be asked in the monitoring. So as long as somebody is there who understands that process and can answer those questions, that's going to be just fine. Everybody doesn't need to be there. So always remember to reference your GERS so that you're aware of the grant guides and expectations from our agency. GERS 23, 25 through 29 talks about your monitoring process. Are there any questions on the monitoring process? But can they as a learning tool? Yeah, you're more than welcome to have whoever you would like in monitoring. You're more than welcome to have them participate in monitoring so they can learn and experience what it's like to meet with the state and know what the requirements are for monitoring and for document retention for your agency. That's totally fine. Are there any other questions? Well, at this time, we want to thank you for your time and participation in the training, and we'll answer any questions that come into the chat box, and we'll hang out for another few minutes. If you have questions, please utilize the chat box to ask them. I want to thank you all for your focus and participation during this training. The PowerPoint also has a contact information for you, which is on the screen, resources, and acronyms. We'll stay on for another few minutes if there's any other remaining questions.